It's that time again, folks! Time for another one of these Kingdom Hearts reviews. And this time, it's one of the more maligned entries in the series. Originally released on the Nintendo 3DS, Dream Drop Distance was the last entry to get a remaster, this time as part of Kingdom Hearts 2.8 Final Chapter Prologue. Alright, whoever keeps naming these things needs to be slapped upside the head. And of course, Dream Drop Distance itself has a silly title, because DDD, as in 3D. Har frickety har! So, what is it that people seem to dislike about this game? Is it really that bad? Let's find out if Dream Drop Distance is actually so awful. I'm specifically going to be looking into the remaster on the PS4, but I'll try to mention some of the differences if I remember. Also, spoilers in the video, so if you're interested in playing this game, this is your warning. The game starts off with a fancy FMV, just like Birth by Sleep did, and I'm not gonna lie, this opening is fantastic. It sort of recaps the previous entries, but does so in a sleek style, with the different sequences from each title blending into one another while Mickey conducts the orchestra from the foreground. Even though it once again reuses Simple and Clean, specifically the orchestral version, I'll let it slide because this is possibly the best opening in the entire franchise. We begin the story with the aftermath of Birth by Sleep's ending, with Zehanort turning the people of Radiant Garden into nobodies before it switches over to a strangely younger Sora and Riku, preparing for the raft trip like the first game, except with Kairi nowhere to be seen, and something is very clearly off about this. Shortly after, Ursula pops up for some reason. There's a brief tutorial, things go foobar, and we wake up in Traverse Town with Sora, who's wearing new threads. And before we continue, I just have to address something.
What happened to Riku? Riku! Hello?
Sora's voice is nails on chalkboard annoying in this game. It's still Haley Joel Osment doing the voice, but for some reason, he does a really irritating pitch for the whole game. I think the intent was to make Sora sound younger in this, but it just does not work. I don't know who's to blame for this decision, but it just drives me bonkers. Anyway, almost immediately after Sora wakes up, he's met by this guy named Neku. Yeah, for some reason, instead of Final Fantasy cameos, this game has cameos from The World Ends With You. And, it doesn't work visually. I realize Kingdom Hearts has always had sort of a weird art style, with anime-esque Sora running around with a cartoon duck and dog, sometimes in a realistic setting. And that's okay. I think the general idea worked on the grounds that they were meant to be different worlds. Problem here is, Neku and his buddies share a similar art style to Sora in the game. The faces and such look fantastic, but The World Ends With You characters all look super anorexic, like their designs weren't updated for the Kingdom Hearts universe. And I'm not trying to knock that game's art style. I think in a vacuum, these character models look superb. It's just when you have Neku standing right there next to Sora like this, all I can think is, somebody give that boy a sandwich! I know this is a little nitpicky, but it's just weird looking to me. Anyway, Neku shortly after introduces two of the game's new mechanics, Flow Motion and Dream Eaters. And I should probably explain the combat. Fighting is a bit flashier looking than what you got in DBS, and it shares a few aspects. The command deck is back, and works pretty much the same as before. Equip your skills in a few slots, blast enemies with said skills, and wait for them to recharge while you smack things with your Keyblade. Flow Motion is a fancy new movement system that chains into different attacks, activated by hitting square when near a wall, object, or enemy. Dream Eaters are your new companions for the adventure, taking up the role of your party members. They're basically the Kingdom Hearts equivalent of Digimon, cute things that support you in battle and make adorable animations. More can be created as the adventure continues, each with their own skill trees and such. And all of this sounds pretty simple and cool. Except it's terrible. Gone is the wonderful command melding from Birth by Sleep, replaced with just buying skills or learning them from your Dream Eaters, which would be fine, except for the way Dream Eaters operate. Gone is the sense of excitement of gaining cool new abilities by mixing and matching, replaced with grinding for affection, or hoping that it's the right random event on a map so you can get the skills you're after. Yeah, I know there was some grinding in BVS, but it was nowhere near as intrusive or time-consuming by comparison. Plus, the command board was actually kind of fun, and your skills would level up quickly when in combat. In Dingus Derp Dumbass, your Dream Eaters learn skills by gaining affection with them, which gains points, which can be spent to learn new abilities. This sounds great on the surface, but it quickly becomes a slog. They don't gain this stuff very fast in combat, which means you're doing the other option, sitting there playing with them in a menu, in a really boring Gigapet-esque minigame. And of course, to get more or better skills, you need to create more of them, which would be really cool, except you need to grind for materials. And the drop rates suck. All of my gameplay footage is from the post-game. This is all after the final boss. And I don't have a great selection of these materials. Yeah, I didn't go out there and farm them, but you'd think I'd at least have something more impressive than this, especially since I barely made new Dream Eaters. Because I never had the materials. Because it was a pain in the ass. Not that you really need much. The game is brain-dead easy, has a certain skill that makes it even easier, and basically devolves into more of a bland, lifeless, mashy slog than Kingdom Hearts 2 on standard. That is, until you get to the game's final world, where suddenly there's a massive difficulty spike and every boss can kill you in one combo if it feels like it, which on the one hand makes the game less boring because, hey, now I actually have to play it, but on the other hand feels completely out of place after how brain-dead it's been up to that point. This is also one of the apparent changes from the 3DS version, which I guess had some AR features that made powering up your Dream Eaters less of a pain in the ass. That being said, I don't think the Dream Eaters were useless. They made decent enough meat shields. I never had to go over and babysit them. In fact, throughout the whole adventure, I think I only had a single one get KO'd. When knocked out, you have to resurrect them in a fairly forgiving amount of time, or they permanently die. But you get the resources that created them back, so the only real loss is the affection, I guess. I also just want to say this. I don't hate the Dream Eaters as a concept. They're cute, do cute things, and I like the idea behind their skill system. It's just that they feel like they were made for a completely different game, and then were shoved into this because the development team couldn't be bothered to make this game. And then there's Flow Motion, which could have been really cool. Bouncing off the walls with powered-up leaps and dashes, spinning off lampposts and grinding rails to chain into your attacks sounds cool. Using the force of momentum to toss enemies larger than you seems like an amazing skill. Except it's really repetition and often triggers when you're just trying to dodge shit. Multiple times I'd go to dodge something and wind up bouncing off a wall and slamming right into what I was trying to avoid. Or I'd dodge forward to get close to an enemy to use a specific skill and instead wind up triggering a flow motion attack. It's a cool concept, but again, terrible execution. And I'm pretty sure I know the reasons why it's in the game, but I'll touch on that just a little bit later. Even the Keyblade isn't that great in this. A lot of the time hitting things with it just feels like you're slapping something with all the force of a wet paper bag filled with marshmallows. A lot of enemies don't even seem to stagger when you use it. Yeah, I know that was sometimes a problem with Birth by Sleep, but it's really noticeable here. And from what I've heard, this is actually an improvement over the 3DS version. There's also one other ability introduced early on called Reality Shift. This is basically something that lets you interact with the environment, and is barely used. It's actually funny how often people get stuck later on because they forget about it, myself included, and there is a couple parts that require it. But enough about that, we've got plot to talk about. Eventually we get ambushed by a member of Organization 13, who seems to have cut some sort of deal with Neku to bring Sora to him. And just when you think it's time for a showdown, Sora develops a sudden case of spontaneous narcolepsy. We then switch over to Riku and take control of him. And this isn't just some short temporary thing. Riku's playable throughout the whole adventure. In fact, one could argue that he's the actual protagonist of this story. And it brings us to another problem. The idiotic drop system. You see, instead of just letting players switch between the characters normally, you have an irritating time limit that's running all the time during gameplay. You can manually switch between them, mind you, but that dumbass time limit is gonna be there up until the end of the game. And then it comes back after you beat it. Yay! And yes, this includes during boss fights. While I was fortunate enough to never drop in the middle of a boss, it came close on more than one occasion. Once that timer hits 0, you'll be forced to switch to the other character. There is an item called Drop Me Not which refills the meter, but the gauge being included at all is a sheer moronic design to begin with. But hey, at least we get to play as Riku, who is functionally the same as Sora in all essence. Well, each character does have one difference. There's a special attack that each one has that differs between them called dual linking. Sora can use his Dream Eaters for a summon-esque move that gives him some invincibility frames and wasn't particularly helpful for most of the game. Riku gains a power-up similar to the forms or command styles. These exist. I honestly barely remembered they were a thing most of this time and wound up not using them very often. And having Riku, while cool, also leads to another problem that I'll mention later. So, Riku teams up with another character from The World Ends With You, and you go through a slightly different Traverse Town with him. There's a bunch of stuff from that game's story that keeps popping up regarding something called the Reaper's game, and it is 100% irrelevant to this game's plot. Seriously, these cameos mean nothing. They mean even less than the average Final Fantasy cameos we've had in the past. Maybe they'll mean something in a later game, but for donkey dweeb disposition? Nah. You then switch between Tweedledee and Tweedledumbass until you clear the world. And before you ask, yes, Tweedledumbass is Sora, who immediately forgives Neku for selling him out because they're friends, even though he's known Neku for like 20 minutes. Seriously, if Sora's getting dumber wasn't noticeable in the past few entries, I'm pretty sure this is proof that he's been losing brain cells ever since Roxas rejoined him back in Kingdom Hearts 2's prologue, because he's an absolute Nimrod in this game. I mean, it's either that or he got into Terra's dumb bitch pills supply. We're eventually treated to a cutscene of Sora and Riku being told they're undergoing special training for the Mark of Mastery, much like how Birth by Sleep's plot was set into motion, except their training is more than slapping balls around. Wingus and Dingus here are sent to wake up sleeping worlds as they're training. So the story, despite Sora's stupidity and pointless cameos, actually sounds like it's off to a pretty decent start. What comes next? Nothing. Seriously, this game's plot is dead for the rest of the game until you get to the last world. Almost nothing happens in it. It is infuriating how boring this game's plot is. It just stops and waits until you get to the ass end before anything happens. And then we get to the rest of the worlds. To their credit, there's some good choices here. We have Hunchback of Notre Dame, Tron Legacy, which despite being based off of a truly awful movie, actually granted my wish of the light cycles being fun in its respective minigame, Pinocchio, but not inside the whale, The Three Musketeers, freaking Fantasia, which is easily the best world in the game, and is an absolute blast, and finally, The World That Never Was. The game follows a pretty normal sense of progression. Finish a few worlds, do a thing, open up a few more, head into the final dungeon. While there's no gummy ship, there is a pre-world minigame to do before each stage, called a dive, and these are pretty okay. Nothing mind-blowing, but the whole thing is simple and fairly fun. They all differ a little, so they don't get stale, and while a few feel like they might last a little too long, they're certainly not too intrusive. Going through these worlds is straightforward and works fine, except for a couple hiccups. And by hiccups, I mean glaring flaws. First off, the worlds have the exact same problems as the last two games I reviewed, except magnified considerably. Once again, these worlds are empty and lacking in interesting content, and while I could look past Birth by Sleep due to its hardware limitations and the fact that the worlds were fairly small,
I prefer intimate.
These are just bad. I write pretty hard on how dull and flat everything was in Kingdom Hearts 2, and while these ones aren't quite so flat, they're even more dull. This game has absolutely massive areas, and there is nothing in them. I'm not sure if these vast, empty wastelands were made and flow motion was made to compensate for them, or if flow motion was made first and they made the wide open emptiness to traverse with it. But it degenerates the game into a hell of a slog. The other problem is, you have to do every world twice. Once as Sora, and once as Riku. Yes, I know you did every world 3 times in Birth by Sleep, but at least in that, it was 3 separate campaigns with unique stories and characters, and each world was relatively compact. These worlds drag their asses, and it's all in one singular playthrough. To the game's credit, there is sometimes a bit of a difference between each version of the world. You don't always retread the same ground, and I do appreciate that. But for a game that already feels like a drag, it doesn't help. I think they should have just either split the worlds between the 2 characters, or made it so you play as one character or the other, Birth by Sleep style. And in all fairness, the worlds do slightly improve after the first half of the game. The Musketeer world was actually fairly enjoyable and had a really great cutscene, which might be the funniest moment in the entire franchise.
Sure, take your time.
Seriously, the cartoon slapstick here is so good. I wish the series had more stuff like this. And the other world that works is the excellent Fantasia. This world is visually gorgeous, has lots of creative uses of flow motion, and both versions have a really good sense of style. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, the game's difficulty just suddenly spikes up during the world that never was. Up to this point, I had never died, and outside of getting screwed over by the flow motion system a couple times, I never even came close. But in this last part of the game, I wound up dying quite a bit, and as arrogant as this might sound, I never really felt like it was my fault. I went from pretty much playing the game on autopilot like Kingdom Hearts 2 to suddenly dying in a single combo from the last handful of bosses just out of nowhere. Maybe the game expected me to have more advanced Dream Eaters or something. I don't know. I didn't care enough to find out. I had never needed better Dream Eaters, and the ones I was using had skills I liked. But suddenly it felt like the game was screaming at me for not having once more or second chance. There's also this weird thing where Riku can't just leave this world normally for some reason. Every other part of the game, he can just up and leave at any save point, but for some reason Riku has to use only this one specific warp point, and I have no idea why. Oh, and of course, this is where the plot suddenly remembers it exists, and it's convoluted as all hell. So it seems Xehanort and his wiggle fingers have been using time travel to get other Xehanorts from history in order to turn Sora into yet another Xehanort, and that was the real purpose of Organization 13, to create more Xehanorts. I think. Also, he keeps seeing Roxas, who's still annoying, but at least doesn't put you through a 2-hour tutorial this time, and no, I will never let that go. Xion, Aqua, and Terra. Which actually does make sense with the context of all the entries up to this point. Seriously, the last thing this series needed after Kingdom Hearts 2 was a more complicated plot, and they really went full ham. Also, they've been tracking Sora this whole time because of his shirt. No, really, that's an actual plot point. Anyway, Sora passes out after his big power of friendship speech and is kidnapped by all of the Xehanorts. Riku stops passing out at random and goes off to save his bestest buddy, and admittedly, it's kind of got a cute scene where the Dream Eaters help him look for Sora. Eventually, he arrives at Organization 13's headquarters and is backed up by Mickey, who casts a pretty badass stop spell on everyone before a young Xehanort one-shots him. Eventually, Axel shows up because he was too popular to stay dead, and he helps save Sora. Riku winds up having to go back and dive into Sora's heart to wake him up, where he fights Ventus? Okay, actually that was kind of a neat plot twist, but the ending to this boss fight was confusing because suddenly it turns into a button-mashing finale, something that really wasn't seen in this game up to that point. Riku gets some last-minute character development, finally overcomes his darkness angst, a major credit to this game's non-plot in all fairness, and everyone wakes up. Riku is picked to be the new Keyblade Master, Sora remains a dumbass, and Axel summons a pretty badass-looking Keyblade. The story ends with Sora going back to Traverse Town to hang out with the Dream Eaters, somehow, and the game comes to a close. But wait, there's more. Like any Kingdom Hearts game, there's post-game content. For one thing, there's a minigame that I never actually investigated whatsoever, and at this point, I really don't care enough to go back to the game. Also, there's a bonus boss, who doesn't seem super difficult, but I was ill-prepared for him because I just kind of walked into its area without knowing he was there, while getting general footage. Yeah, I know, excuses. It actually kind of annoyed me that he popped up while I was just running around normally instead of the usual, "Hey, you wanna go fight this guy?" prompt. And why do I consider most of this game a slog? Well, beyond the terrible world design, the non-plot for the majority of it, and the messy combat, there's one skill type that absolutely dominates the game. The balloon family of spells. Yeah, I know, it's a little bit hypocritical to mention this, given that I'm the one who said that Birth by Sleep was most enjoyable by learning a variety of skills, and that's probably true of this game too. But Balloon is just so easy to get, and it's absolutely broken. And considering the bosses in this game all have absurd amounts of HP and have basically become damage sponges, and the sheer amount of destructive force Balloon and Balloonra have, it kinda just became a default attack for me. And even beyond the combat, there's just so many issues that plagued the game for me. So, do I recommend Drippity Derpity Dinkletork? Ha! Balloons no! I honestly wanted to enjoy this game. After completely loving Birth by Sleep even with its flaws, I was looking forward to future entries, but this game honestly feels like it was rushed to meet some kind of quota. It's not bereft of quality, mind you. It looks nice, especially the remaster. The music is absolutely phenomenal. It's bright and colorful, having Riku be playable for half the game is a cool idea, and the Dream Eaters are adorable. The game just winds up feeling so lacking in soul. The boss battles drag on, even if they're not terrible, for the most part. The worlds have some nice choices, but they feel entirely pointless or bland, and something else I never mentioned is that your characters have virtually no ties to them. It's an even more egregious case of just being a retelling, but with Sora in the game, because Sora and the game barely even interact with these characters this time. There's tons of cool concepts, but most of them are either underdeveloped, pointless, or wind up being more aggravating than helpful. It's a shame after such a strong opening, the rest of the game feels so lukewarm by comparison. And seriously? Time travel? If this is the only full game included in 2.8 Final Chapter Prologue, is a little bit insulting. It makes me want to give in and say something inappropriate, like a certain word starting with N. Nimoy! Thank you guys so much for watching. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. Or better yet, don't! Go watch a video for a fun game, like my Birth by Sleep review. That game was freaking awesome and you can go find out why by watching it. Or you can check out one of the other reviews. But seriously, Birth by Sleep is an absolute treasure.